First, an announcement of an upcoming event. Our sponsors of tonight's esteemed speaker also have a program which will follow this one, Wednesday, October 21st. The 5-college program in Peace and World Security Studies, run here at Hampshire by Michael Clare and Yogesh Chandrani, are presenting on Wednesday, October 21st, an extraordinarily well-known and very effective speaker who is Smitu Kothari, who will talk about Are Liberalization and Justice Compatible? The Social Consequences of Economic Globalization in India. He's the founder of Lokayan, which translates as Dialogue of the People, which is a center for activists and scholars, and also the author of Ecological Justice, Nature, Culture, and Democracy in India. Again, that's 7:30 p.m. Wednesday, October 21st, in the New York room of Mary Willie Hall, Mount Holyoke College. Thank you. About a year ago, many of you, whom I recognize, were here in this place as we celebrated the life, contribution, and we thought the retirement of tonight's speaker. It was such an extraordinary occasion, filled with warmth, with learning, with an assemblage of people that only Eqbal could be responsible for bringing together, that President Prince, who's here somewhere, made up in his mind to ensure that Eqbal would never effectively retire from Hampshire. So we are going to bring him back in perpetuity. Tonight is, in fact, probably the culminating lecture. No, tomorrow will be that. Eqbal's been here most of September and October and will return, I think, as long as we treat him well and energy holds out. It's a real pleasure to introduce Eqbal Ahmed, and I'll do it briefly, which is counted to my tendencies. Eqbal was born in Bihar, India, where he lived with his family in the homestead that I was told that family occupied for over 400 years. And with the partition of India into India and Pakistan, many of the family moved, Eqbal among them, but the mother, the materfamilias, refused to move since it had been her family home for over 400 years. So everybody else left, with the exception of his father, who had tragically been assassinated in Eqbal's presence before the family moved to Pakistan. He came to the United States to study and immediately became one of the chief strategists for the FLN in Algeria, as any good, serious student of theory would do. Incredibly, to me at least, Eqbal's career is marked by serious stints of deep involvement, purposeful and effective involvement in almost all of the major social movements of our time since he came here in the 60s. Civil rights, taught at a freedom school. He was deeply involved in civil rights activities all over the South, including Mississippi. Anti-war, his name is forever linked with others as part of the Harrisonburg 8, who I think, among other things, spilled blood all over the draft records of a number of people and got them arrested and gained them, in a sense, a place in the annals of anti-war activists. He's had a brilliant scholarly career. He's taught at Cornell, University of Chicago, and, of course, at Hampshire, where he really distinguished himself as a scholar. He's been a part of other kinds of institutions, like the Institute for Policy Studies, the major left think tank in this country. And he was also a founding member of the Transnational Institute in Amsterdam, probably the most well-known counterpart of IPS in Europe. Those are the highlights. I thought I would run out of important things to say, and I asked some of my friends what I should be sure to mention as I crafted this brief introduction. Caroline Bingelsdorf said the most important thing to say about Eqbal was that not too long ago, when she was an undergraduate at Cornell, he picked her up as she was hitchhiking along the road, and that she's convinced is responsible for all of his esteem and accomplishments, certainly his journey to Hampshire. Yoke said the most important thing to say about him is that you will note that during this talk, he will say, there are 6 things that I must impress upon you. He probably will mention only 5 or maybe 12, but he will claim that there are 6. Margaret said, and this is the last thing that I will recount, that Eqbal is the only gentleman among us who could actually wear the raincoat of Sarah Soleri, a close friend of his, and make it look dashing, even though it's obviously the trench coat of a relatively small woman. It's a real pleasure to introduce a good friend, a man who has meant the world to so many of us here at Hampshire, a man we hope never retires and is always with us. My friend, my brother, our esteemed colleague, Eqbal Ahmed, is going to talk about fire on the mountain, Southeast Asia after the nuclear explosions.
Now, after hearing that introduction, which one of you ever doubts or can doubt that black is beautiful? It is.
A little complex.
Yes. Complex and beautiful. All beauty is complex. Okay. Could I should perhaps say, but to begin with, that I'm delighted to be back at Hampshire College to call on a new wave of student activism, which I've noticed this year, starting to sprout up again. It's the Klingberg cycle, I think, returning in America. So I would like to request, before I begin, Amy to make an announcement or two.
Hi, I'm here, I'll make this very short. I'm just here as a representative of the Hampshire Human Rights Group to announce that we'll be meeting directly after this lecture in the Merrill Living Space, and all students are welcome, and we'll have a chance to discuss some of the issues that are brought up at this lecture, as well as continue to plan our campaigns against U.S. military spending in Latin America, and also begin researching new campaigns like human rights in Afghanistan and economic sanctions in Iraq and whatever else people want to talk about. So you're all invited, and we hope to see you all there.
Now you will notice that Amy's announcement is a triumph of hope over experience. She imagines that there is an after this lecture. Before I begin, I would like to announce that on the topic on which I am about to start talking, there are 2 persons in this audience who know more than I do. One by his studies, and the other by being both by his experience and by being a bone of contention. He is at the root of the nuclear arms race in between India and Pakistan. That second one is Agha Ashraf Ali, who sits right in front of me and whom I would like to invite to comment on this talk and extend it further, take it farther in terms of prospects for peace between our two countries. And the second is Larry Lifshaw's, who has been all of this last year in researching the nuclear arms race in South Asia. And I would like to invite him to join in the discussion. Now to the subject. May 11th, 1998. Your memories are fresh. The desert shook in India, more specifically in Rajasthan, from where Vivek comes, who is teaching some of you. 3 nuclear devices were exploded about 300 meters below the earth. And the earth shook violently. It was, said one of the scientists present, like Lord Krishna lifting the mountain. Note his words. It was like Lord Krishna, the Hindu deity of the great epics and the religious books, lifting the mountains. In Pakistan, we all, including me, including I, held our breath. Some of us talked, traveled the country, spoke, wrote, in a futile effort to stop Pakistani government from following on the example of India. The Indian leaders appear to have been keen to push Pakistani leaders to follow their example. They kept taunting them, provoking them, until the 9th day when they tested a new missile system, the Pinaka, which with its 55-mile range was a Pakistan-specific weapon. The Pakistanis came next. The mountain shook. And in total awe, frankly, I'm not given easily to feeling deep fear. But as I watched on television the image of the Shagai mountain under which our tests were carried out, Pakistani tests were carried out, I literally shook with fear. It was a frightening sight. It's a dry area, Balochistan. And you saw on television this camera focus on this very dry mountain, white, colored like white sand, huge, turning slowly over a minute of, over 5 to 10 minutes into bright pink, and then turn to ash, color of ash. And the Pakistani scientists and politicians who had gone there to witness the event all shouted, Allahu Akbar, is great. In some ironic way, Lord Krishna and Allah join hands. About 1,000 miles across the nuclear divide. And our politicians and decision makers miss the irony. They miss the irony that they had appropriated the power that was God's alone. The power to kill mountains, to make deserts tremble, to bring the sea to boil. In short, to destroy the earth itself and all that lives on it. Why? Why did this happen? That's the question I would like to examine with you. Why? To comprehend it, first we should look at the matter very narrowly, in narrow, limited terms of the national interest as crackpot realists and students of international relations have been defining it in this world of nation states. Looking at it even from the point of national interest and nationalism, I would argue with you that these explosions made no sense at all, either for India or Pakistan. First, I shall argue this position, that it made no sense at all. And then, yet again, there will remain the question of why. Why did they do it? And there will arise another question. Where do we go from there? For India, it's the bigger country. I will take it first. It made no sense at all. Consider India's greatest asset. In the 52 years that India has been independent, decolonized country, a member of the modern community of nations, its greatest international asset has been its image. Its image as an ancient civilization which produced Buddha, which produced Gandhi, which served as a model, philosophical model for people like Albert Luthuli of South Africa, or Bishop Tutu of South Africa, or Martin Luther King of the United States of America. And that country, with all its faults, all its failings, all its failures, all its poverty, continued to be viewed as somehow a big promise of a different kind of world, threw away in one go its greatest effort, the image of nonviolence. Its representation as a country that has stood for peace. Do the leaders of India know what they threw away? In this age, in modern times? Clearly, they do not. Or take its greatest burden, not only its greatest asset. The greatest burden of modern India is its poverty. It's a country now of roughly 1 billion people. Just a little short of 1 billion, maybe. Maybe not. Census has not been taken for 5 years or more. And we know by most estimates about 450 to 500 million people are living below the poverty line. Which in India means that they do not have the 2,000 caloric intake necessary to keep the human body intact. 500 million people's children are being born with possible brain damage. That disadvantage, that much malnutrition. Nobody understands that. India, the seat of a great civilization, with a very large educated middle class, high level of scientific and technological knowledge, has over the last 45 years had remained stuck for 45 years with a low rate of growth at about 3.5 to 4%. Economists could not grasp this problem. People like Amartya Sen, who just received the Nobel Prize in Economics, said that this was the burden of poverty, this rate of growth. An uncomprehending economist started calling it the Hindu rate of growth, jokingly, as if there was no other explanation. Then, 5 years ago, equally mysteriously, India broke out of the Hindu rate of growth. And for the previous 5-6 years, it was showing a nearly 7% rate of economic growth. Foreign investment was pouring into India. Japanese and American and German corporations were moving into India. This year, India's rate of growth was predicted at 7.5 to 8.5%. And for the next 10 years, it was predicted to be a minimum of 7%, possibly up to 10% rate of growth. Then they explode this bomb. The expected happens. The Western countries and Japan clamped an economic sanctions on it, clamped an embargo, and this year, India's rate of growth is going to go back to the Hindu rate of growth, 4%. Why did they do it to themselves? So they threw away their greatest asset, and they refused to overcome their greatest liability at a time when they were actually overcoming it. Or take a third problem. India developed for itself in international relations an unnecessary, uncalled for, but a stupid problem in 1960s, early 60s. It got into a conflictual rivalry with China. It got into a war with China, and since then, its relations with China remained rotten. Now, you all recall that China is the biggest country in the world in population terms, more than 1 billion people. And India is the second biggest giant of the world, Asia, with about 1 billion people in the world. And these two giants were quarreling with each other. Then, 3 years ago, India and China had the wisdom to start normalizing their relations. I was in Delhi on November 28, 1997, when Jiang Zemin, the president of China, arrived in Delhi. And it was a festive occasion. This was the first visit of a Chinese head of state to India in 30 years. And the Indian Prime Minister and the Chinese President signed agreements to improve relations between their two countries, including the reduction of forces along their long, large, thousands of miles of frontier. Mr. Jiang Zemin, President of China, came to Pakistan after India. Now Pakistan has been the old friend of China. India has always sided with Pakistan on its disputes. China has always sided with Pakistan on its disputes with India. But this time, the Chinese were advising Pakistanis, make peace with India. Even on Kashmir, from where our Ashraf Ali comes, make a settlement. Find ways to establish normal relations with each other. Then, this new government came to power. It's a fundamentalist Hindu nationalist government. And the first thing they did before testing their weapons to stop talking about the danger from China, as if their nuclear weapons will be tested against China. Thus, they threw away the greatest achievement of the previous government, Gujarat's government, which was to start normalizing relations with China. Today, by having exploded the bomb, India has entered into a deadly arms race with one of the fastest growing economies of the world. If India competes with China, India will meet the same fate as Russia met in competing on arms race with America. You can go bankrupt. I will come back later on Pakistan. We are running the same danger in relation to India. You are with me?
Yes.
Yes? Okay. So there they ruined their third achievement. India has now entered into an arms race with China. Or take fourthly, we all know, and it is completely comprehensible, that is a big Asian power 1 billion people, enormous resources, large intelligentsia, a huge middle class, highly developed infrastructure, etc., etc., etc. India has ambitions to play the role of a major power, at least in the region. We all also know that to be a major power on world scale or at a regional scale, you have to be acceptable. You have to have the consent. You have to have the respect of your neighbors. If neighbors don't like you, you ain't nobody in the neighborhood. That's the simple fact of life. Now, India already had an ongoing dispute with Pakistan. And it already had, under the Gujarat government, it started to improve its relations with the other neighbors, Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka, and then they explode the bomb. The bomb has scared the hell out of everybody. And you know why? South Asia is an ecological unit. South Asia is one ecological unit divided into 4 nation states. If a bomb goes off, the radiation will reach everybody. If India bombs Pakistan or Pakistan hits India, Bangladeshis will die, Nepalis will die, Sri Lankans will die. The wind blows every which way. Therefore they are all angry. And they all see the Indian bomb as a weapon of bullying. What do they want it for? What do they want it for? Says the Bangladeshi. What do they want it for? Says the Sri Lanka. What do they want it for? Says the Nepalis. Why do it? Why frighten your neighbors? Why do that? Or, anyway, one could go on. I don't want to waste too much of your time. The question then arises, why did India go nuclear? Makes no sense. I've only given you 4 points for this, showing it makes no sense. Why did they do it? And there you begin to understand the world a little bit, the world we live in. First of all, India, like America, and earlier like the Soviet Union, and earlier like France, Indian political leaders view nuclear weapons as a currency of power. It's a currency of power and prestige in this world of nation states. And that's why France went nuclear. That's why the British insisted, we cannot be proper cousins with you, meaning with the Americans. Cousinship requires that we too share these weapons with each other. It's a currency. It's viewed as a currency of power. The way in which the gunpowder was viewed as a currency of power in the 17th century, or the battleship came to be viewed as a currency of power in the 19th century. To recall to you Henry Kissinger's wonderful line, nuclear weapons. In our time, nuclear weapons are the modern equivalent of showing the flag. Those are the actual sentence I'm quoting from Kissinger. Nuclear weapons are the modern equivalent of showing the flag. Display of nuclear weapons. You know what he meant by it. Battleships used to show the flag. When you didn't like the Latin American government, American Navy used to parade up and down. And the other side sort of saw the point. So there is this view of nuclear weapons as a weapon for projecting power, as a primary element of projection of power. And the United States, quite unfortunately, has continued to provide a model for treating nuclear weapons as the primary element of power, even after the Cold War has ended. During the Cold War, there was a certain kind of justification being offered by the theorists. We are in battle between the evil empire and us. There is a war between democracy and totalitarianism. There is a war between communism and freedom, blah, 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 blah. When that's all over, the United States has continued, although its officials do not acknowledge the fact. I'll give you a few facts about it. First of all, the START II treaty. Nobody's stupid, they all read. They're not wise, but they're not stupid. So they read the fine print of the START II treaty. It gives the United States superiority over all other powers, all group of powers. The United States has 350, believe it or not, 3,500 nuclear warheads, all of which are functional. The United States has, the Russians in principle have 3,000 warheads, only a small amount of which are by now functional because their army is not functioning. The systems are declining. But more importantly, the United States-Russian agreement of the fall of 1991 on the elimination of tactical nuclear weapons as battlefield weapons from Europe has left the United States with battlefield capability. Because, one, its F-111 bombers are still based in UK and are still equipped with nuclear warheads. And two, now, since last year, the United States has provided Israel with the same capability as it now holds for itself in UK. In other words, an air-to-ground battlefield capability which keeps totally intact its graduated response capability throughout the world. It's a world with a global outreach, while denying such a capability to everyone else. In this situation, the United States has started expanding its nuclear outreach by the expansion of its navy. And this naval expansion reached the Indian Ocean and the Persian Gulf during the years 1990 and 1993. 1990, the Gulf War took American capabilities throughout the Middle East. And then the bases from Diego Garcia have taken the outreach of the American Navy all over. Now, some of you might have noticed that the American government quite cleverly invited the Indian Navy to join in the naval exercises that the American Navy was carrying out in the Indian Ocean. But joining somebody else's exercise can whet your appetite rather than calm you down. So in other words, I am pointing out to you that the international environment of counting nuclear weapons as a currency of power not only remained, but was in some ways and in some areas, such as the Middle East and South Asia, this perception was accentuated by American policies, was accelerated, augmented by American policy. Thirdly, the United States declared a moratorium on testing in 1992. We were all very happy that America has now finally decided that it will not carry out nuclear tests anymore. Then slowly, they all began to realize, not I shouldn't say we, not me, that this wasn't happening. Tests would be carried out. Two things happened. One, by commissioning extremely powerful supercomputers, the United States acquired the capability to simulate tests. Now, those computers are not available to Pakistan and India. So it was able to start simulating a whole lot of new tests without anybody being able to detect it. And secondly, they had the technological prowess to carry out small-scale tests and yet get enough results. Now, the Atomic Energy Commission, what is called IATA, the International Atomic Energy
Agency.
Help me.
Agency.
International Atomic Energy, for example, asked the United States, and has not received replies to the effect that it detected at least 15 such tests, underground tests, in 1996 alone. And many more may not have been detected. Therefore, the big superpower, which now has no other rival left, was actually violating its own precepts, its own non-proliferation policy, its own declarations of stopping testing while asking others not to do so. More importantly, the United States non-proliferation policy, which is partially successful, because after all, Algeria decided not to test. Brazil gave up its nuclear research facilities, weapons facilities. South Africa dismantled its nuclear weapons after Mandela came into power. So in a sense, America's non-proliferation policies have had some success, and yet they have not been even policies. They have not been honest policies. They have been marked with hypocrisy and internal violations. For example, I have mentioned to you already the expansion of America's own nuclear power into the Gulf and the Indian Ocean. I should also not mention the fact that the United States has not only looked the other way and not protested, nor imposed any sanctions on Israel for developing nuclear weapons, whose existence we all know and threatens everybody, but more importantly, they have actually provided Israel with the most modern, advanced delivery capabilities, including most recently the F-11 aircrafts. These examples have not been reassuring to those who take nuclear weapons seriously as a currency of power. Finally, two more factors should be, and before I go to the next factor, I should give you my views on the issue. My views are that we should not take nuclear weapons seriously as a currency of power. This view of seeing nuclear weapons as a component of power is an outdated, stupid, Kissingerian view of the world and of nuclear weapons, which has nothing to do with real-life strategic considerations. Let me show you why. It was a coincidence of some sort that the rise of America, the emergence of America as a superpower after World War II coincided with the development by Americans of nuclear weapons. Once that coincidence had occurred, and the United States had actually used nuclear weapons in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and nuclear weapons became a major aspect of the arms race between the Soviet Union and the United States, it came to be seen as a component of power. But then two things happened. The two things happened which the colonized minds in India and Pakistan did not register. Cuba, without nuclear weapons, obtained its liberation in the teeth of opposition from the United States. And American nuclear weapons were of no use in stopping Castro's rise to power. It was no use in ending Castro in power either. Okay. You can explain Cuba away. You can explain Cuba away by saying, well, the Cubans had the protection of another nuclear power, the Soviet Union. And that protection was kind of demonstrated in a backhanded way in the Cuban Missile Crisis. So an argument can be offered that no, nuclear weapons remained an important component of power because Cuba would not have survived if it did not have the protection of the Soviet Union. You see my point? I lose. But Vietnam, hallelujah. Vietnam fought a war. Americans repeatedly, in one negotiation, 13 times, Le Doctor told me, Kissinger threatened to use nuclear weapons. Vietnam and say, go ahead, do it. We'll see. Then, in case it is seen, in case the Vietnamese are counting on Russian protection, Kissinger and Nixon did something extraordinary, which has been forgotten by a lot of analysts. Those of you who were alive and remember that moment, the Christmas bombings, will you please recall that Richard Nixon was going to Moscow. He was scheduled to go to Moscow to meet with Brezhnev as part of the American-Soviet détente. And 5 days before going to Moscow, he started the Christmas bombing of North Vietnam. I had at that point argued, look, and a lot of newspapers, everybody said, he shouldn't have been doing it now, because now the meeting between Soviet Union and Washington will be cancelled. I had argued, look, what the Americans are doing is delinking Soviet-American relations from a war of national liberation. What they are doing is to make sure that the Soviets, they have taken a risk. If Soviets receive them, then the Soviets are saying to Vietnamese, you are alone. You're on your own. We'll give you what help we can in material terms, but you can't get between in the relationship between us and the other superpower. Delinking fully occurred, and Vietnam defeated America. First defeat in American history. I should give you a third example. I was sitting, this is some years ago, it's an illustrative example. I was sitting with the American ambassador, who was at that time a man called Robert Oakley in Pakistan. I went to interview him about Afghanistan. And as he was talking to me, it dawned on me that he actually talks about Pakistan the way the British Viceroy used to talk about each other. I said to him, you know, Mr. Oakley, you are the Viceroy here. So he kind of looked very pleased. Now he said, a lot of people think that, but really I have no power over here, etc., etc. And I said, no, Bob, actually it's much worse than that. You have power and it's totally hollow. He said, what do you mean? I said, come with me to the window. I took him out to his window of his office. And I said, look out in the streets there. He said, yes. I said, what do you see? He said, I see what you see, cars. So I said, now please count. Is there a single American car there? They said, no, they're all Japanese. So I said, that's the point. They got the power, you have the image. That's it. The Japanese are there in our homes through their television. Our cars are Japanese, our television is Japanese, our gadgets are Japanese, our aid is more Japanese than American right now, and you keep thinking that you are a big guy because you have nuclear weapons and you got the image of the big bomb, and you're Viceroy. It's broken, it's gone. And he looked at me, he said, it takes an American to see this so clearly. I said, no, man, it takes a radical to see it so clearly. So the point I'm making is, in our time, something new has happened. That is to say, there has been a delinking. For the first time in the history of the world, there has been a delinking of economic power and military powers. Today, there are 3 major economic powers: the United States, Japan, Germany. and 4 or 5 that come immediately after that. The weight of all the 4 or 5, plus these 2, other than America, is much greater than of America economically. And none of them are military powers. Japan and Germany certainly aren't. Given that delinking, what the hell are the Indians and Pakistanis going for? Their minds are colonized. They should see differently. So all I was saying is that I don't agree with that, but their perception is still a colonial perception, 19th century perception of the linkages between power, military power, and power. 2 last points to be made for why India tested. The end of the Cold War ended a perceived balance of terror in which non-nuclear nations felt that they were secure because one power couldn't use nuclear weapons on them without risking retaliation from the other. Each of the third world countries felt, including India, that we had a nuclear umbrella of one power or the other. That in this bipolar world, there won't be new use of nuclear weapons by a nuclear power on a non-nuclear country. The end of the Cold War has removed that perception. And that perception has become stronger with the American refusal to sign a world treaty that would say, as a nuclear power, it will never use nuclear weapons on non-nuclear countries. Do you know the US refuses to sign such a paper? It has made no declaration, multilateral or unilateral, that it will not use nuclear weapons on non-nuclear countries. And yet, it asks countries not to become nuclear. You see the unevenness I'm talking about. And finally, their race with Pakistan had accelerated. The Indian government made a very bad mistake 3 years ago by developing and then deploying a missile system called Prithvi, which is a Pakistan-specific missile system capable of carrying nuclear warheads. When they deployed the damn Prithvis all around the border, the Pakistanis got more serious about developing their own missile system. They got into the arms race. And thus began a missile arms race in the subcontinent. Now, in April of this year, it all happened this year, isn't it? In April, Pakistan tested its new missile system called Gauri with a range of 1,000 miles. The Indian government could not believe that the Pakistanis had developed a missile system with such a range. I was in Delhi at the time and interviewed a number of government officials, including some of the leaders of the BJP, which is now the ruling party. Their perception was that the Chinese have held Pakistan. Therefore, the Chinese are kind of catching them from the back. And this could have encouraged them to go ahead and test their own weapons. And absolutely finally, India has been fighting an insurgency in Kashmir. which is an Indian-held territory. And it has a conviction that this insurgency will end only when Pakistan stops aiding the insurgents. It had an expectation that if it explodes its bomb, it might frighten Pakistan enough to stop its support of Kashmiri insurgents. That would partly explain the fact that 3 days after testing their nuclear device, Mr. Lal Krishna Advani, who is the Home Minister of India, Minister of Interior, publicly said Pakistan must now understand that the strategic equation has changed in India's favor and it must stop supporting the insurgency in Kashmir. And 6 days later, Mr. Advani made statements to the effect that India might invade Pakistan to punish it, all of which merely frightened the Pakistanis even more. These were probably the reasons for India to go at it. But now we are in it. We are in it full scale. And Pakistan went at it, as you know, on May 29, 1998. Among many other people, and I want to stress the among many other, because the New York Times had a story that seemed to imply that I was alone in Pakistan in opposing these weapons, but I was not. A lot of more people, a lot more eloquently, including some former Army and Air Force officers, opposed the idea of Pakistan testing. But the Pakistanis waited for about 11 days with hesitation and then tested. I had argued, don't do it, for a number of reasons. First of all, everybody knew that Pakistan had some nuclear capability. And everybody knows that it's a smaller, weaker of the two countries. So I argued with them on a strategic ground, for God's sake, don't do anything. Because as Sun Tzu, the great Chinese strategist of 2,000 years ago, had argued, when there is such a situation between a weak power and a smaller country, the weaker one, between a strong power and a weak country, the weaker one doesn't show its weapons. You're better off not demonstrating your strength. Why bother? My second argument was that this is not a currency of power, which I have argued with you. My third argument was that our real challenge was economic. And we are going to be hit badly. There is going to be sanctions. India is a big country, it can absorb sanctions. We are a small, poor country, we will not be able, and we are also more connected to the bloody international market than India. We'll get badly hit, and that's what has happened. And my final argument was that militarization of society hurts its culture, its politics, its way of life. Don't ruin it. We are already badly hit, badly ruined. Why do further? So now the sanctions have come. We are in what, the 6th month of sanction now, right? And it's hurting like crazy. And the country is turning more and more towards the right. So much more towards the right that the last 3 days I have had emails from friends saying, don't return for a while, when they are that scared. And it's the direct result of the militarization and turning the country more towards the right. India is also going the same way, but because it is larger, it is able to absorb more. So, two questions arises. And that's with those I will take with you. The first is, what's happening now? And the second is, how to look at the future. On what is happening now, I want to say this to you. Not among anybody in this audience, but I found in New York and Washington a tendency on the part of people, informed people, policy-making people, to say, you guys can't handle these weapons. Oh, that's pure racism. That is poppycock. The truth is, nobody can handle these weapons. Don't tell yourself that some bloody white men in gray suits can handle the weapons better than some non-wise men in khaki clothes, hand-woven clothing can't handle it. This is nonsense. The weapon is evil. It shouldn't exist. It ought to be eliminated globally, and don't talk about it to me regionally. I'm opposed to the Pakistani and Indian weapons because I'm there now. I oppose to the Indian American weapons because then I'm here now. It's not a regional issue. It's a global problem, and it should be addressed globally. Number one. Number two, I'm happy to inform you, which may surprise you a little bit, that by comparison with America and Europe, maybe because there is this time lag, there is more of an anti-nuclear movement in South Asia 1 year after the first test than there was in the Western world 20 years after the first tests. No comparison between your movement and ours. May I cite? First of all, I've said to you, this is the Times story of, Eqbal Ahmed is the lone dissenter in Pakistan. What the bloody bullshit. It wasn't. He isn't. But I'll give you 3 examples. Hiroshima Day was August 6th of this year. I was neither in Pakistan nor India. I was already in the United States. But I read in the newspapers and on the web that on the August 6th demonstrations against nuclear weapons, 250,000 people turned out in Calcutta. And 30,000 people turned out in Delhi. And led by among others, a rather smallish and beautiful young woman named Arundhati Roy, the novelist. And in Pakistan, which is a smaller country, there are about 2,000 people in Karachi, 1,000 in Lahore, and I'm ashamed to tell you, only 250 in Islamabad. But such is life. What I'm trying to say is there is an anti-nuclear and peace movement in that country, in those 2 countries, earlier, 20 years earlier than they were here in this country. So things are not that bad after all. I would like to give you a second example. I read on the web a few days ago that 50 officers of the defense services of India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh have signed a statement against the two countries possessing nuclear weapons. The statement reads in part, the following quotation: "By virtue of our experience and the positions we have held in the armed forces, we have a fair understanding of the destructive parameters of conventional and nuclear weapons. We are of the considered view that nuclear weapons should be banished from the South Asian region, and indeed from the entire globe." Quotes closed. The signatories of this statement include a former Pakistani Chief of the Air Force, Air Marshal Dr. Chaudhry, another Chief of the Pakistani Air Force, Air Marshal Asghar Khan, the outgoing Chief of the Indian Navy, Admiral L. Ramdas, and a Chief of the Indian Army Staff, Lieutenant General Gurmeet Man Singh. You can't get more senior officers, such senior officers, even in this country, to make such a statement. General Butler is an exception, and a very late one. So things were not as bad, perhaps, as they look on paper. Where do we go from here is the next question. First thing I want to say is that sanctions did not work before and will not work now. Pakistan was under severe sanctions from the United States. Sanctions imposed against building nuclear weapons and against testing for 8 years. It got away with it and defied it. Sanctions won't work and will not last, also because these are not countries a superpower looking for opportunities can ignore. Pakistan is too strategic for the United States, for the wild grab in which it is so interested in Central Asia, and India is too big a market for it to be ignored. So the quicker they take the sanctions off, the better they are and we are. The second is that the arms race has begun in Asia, which includes China and India now, and Pakistan. And my great fear is that within years, the United States, which has now fed the sanctions, imposed the sanctions, will be feeding the arms race. It will be feeding the arms race because it needs India to balance China. And its old view of the world, balancing the search for balance of power politics, the seeking for balancing mechanism, it would want to use a nuclear India as a balancing mechanism against nuclear China. Already, certain elements, I don't have time to go into that, powerful elements in American society are making that argument. We have to fight against that phenomenon. And my last point is that there is a risk of nuclear holocaust between India and Pakistan as long as India and Pakistan remain enemies of each other, adversaries of each other. Therefore, the only security we have to remove this threat from our lives and from the world is to seek peace between India and Pakistan. There is one major bone of contention, and that is our Ashraf and his country, his people, his state called Kashmir. We have to find a resolution to this dispute. Both India and Pakistan are stuck in old positions. They cannot be moved without international pressure. That pressure has to be built on both countries. Other than that, I would like to invite my two guests to start up your discussion with their comments. Thank you. I've been informed that, as usual, I have spoken very long, but we have a little opportunity. We shall keep this side of the discussion short. Still.
I think I'll get that.
This is certainly a wonderful second opportunity to speak from here. Last time I was ill. This time I can speak with greater confidence. I have just come back from Kashmir and I am in no mood whatsoever to speak or comment on the hair-raising, deep, penetrating analysis of the South Asian scenario. I will take this opportunity, as I've been doing the last 2 weeks in a lot of public lecturing, to take your mind off, almost like an anticlimax, into some other world in the few minutes that I have. I'm doing this to throw up a suggestion which will somehow create a bridge between the two countries. And certainly Hampshire College is one of the places where it could happen. I have been saying of late that there is no magic in life. There's nothing profound in saying that. But occasionally there is the magic of the human personality and the human mind. And I'm sharing these two events which I consider possible only in the latter half of the 20th century. It wasn't possible at all before. And this is the magic in our time, and still possible. I became a believing Muslim at the age of 60. Because of a book written by a Christian missionary. His name is Kenneth Cragg, who wrote a book called The Event of the Quran. This book was awarded a prize by the Bros Foundation of Evanston, Illinois. Part of the will was that one book every decade on religion which is significant will be so awarded. The Prophet of Islam, I'm talking about rather funny things as an anticlimax, said, when you're born from the womb of your mother, you're born once. But when you're born unto yourself, you're born again. I was born in a Muslim home and accepted this, that, and the other, became a Marxist, fought in Kashmir, fought in India. But at the age of 60, something that's only possible as magic in our time, I saw through a lot of crap about religion and embraced Kenneth Cragg. The other story is poignant, almost tragic, but that too I must share with you today. A friend of mine from childhood days in Pakistan, Lahore, where we used to go in the winters, took a PhD from Cambridge in the early 50s on the philosophy of the Quran, on the philosophy of the Muslim religious scripture. Dr. Dawood Rehbar wrote a remarkable work on Allah. Allah, of course, means God. Allah, God of Justice. That is the title of the book, published by Leiden, the most outstanding publishers of books on Islam, who also published the Encyclopedia of Islam. And it was considered to be a departure in Islamic thought. And another magic that was only possible in our century, latter half of our century. He goes back to Pakistan, gives his vast big library that his father kept for 30 years, but the best library is really huge, to the University of Punjab, and wants to begin his life there. And as an Islamic colloquian in Lahore in the early 50s, he also reads a paper. And the religious scholars who have come from Egypt and who come from Iraq and from other countries denounce him and say this paper must be expunged from the proceedings of the conference. There's Louis Massignon there, and there's Hadley, there are outstanding international scholars. They say, let's discuss it. What is this point about throwing it out? The Vice Chancellor of the University comes by night and says, my job is in danger. Here's a ticket. You go to Turkey. We'll find you a job there, but please leave. So Dr. Dawood Rehbar arrives in Turkey and starts teaching Urdu. And the Pakistan embassy starts persecuting him. To the extent that Dawood Rehbar, a poet, Dawood Rehbar, a musician of creative range, and a scholar, approaches Kenneth Cragg, look at the charming coincidence, who is in Palestine doing his job as a missionary, for making him a Christian. He discourages, he understands what can happen. But he goes into a church, into a small church in Ankara, and accepts Christianity. And from pillar to post for years, and finally, for 28 years, Dawood Rehbar has been teaching comparative religion in the Boston University. Now retired, living in Florida. And if I may throw out a suggestion, such opportunities don't come my way easily. I don't think it is beyond the resources of the United States or a progressive college like the Hampshire College to invite him. For what a feast it would be to have Dawood Rehbar here. He was teaching music, Indian music, classical music. He's delivering on the 13th of November a lecture at the MIT on various schools of Indian music. He is a poet of repute and has translated outstanding works of Chinese and other authors into poetry in Urdu. And he would be, for a few months, a great bridge with tremendous potential for the other magic that is possible today. In the realm of spirit, in the realm of universal, India and Pakistan could yet be together. I would rather talk about this than the tremendous repercussions and tragic possibilities because of that bone of contention, which is the Valley of Kashmir. Almost 60,000 people have died in Kashmir, and we have a population of 2 million. That proportion should give you an idea of the havoc, the devastation that it means in every home in the Valley of Kashmir. And yet, at the age that I am, and having gone through for 50 years, and considering those two countries one, I feel that I could do no better than talk about the magic of finding such persons and letting them their final utterance before they fade away. Thank you.
I've worked as a journalist in South Asia for on and off for over 2 decades. And I've spent the last 7 or 8 months focused on a fear of mine that has been growing gradually, that the next possible use of nuclear weapons after Nagasaki could occur in South Asia. A week before the Indian test on May 11th, I was invited by an acquaintance to a farm outside of Islamabad, about an hour away, where he had asked me to come because a Pakistani general that he knew wanted to meet me. I had recently edited and published a book on Hiroshima and the politics of the decision that went into the dropping of nuclear weapons on both Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So a week before the Indian blast, I met this Pakistani general, and he had heard about the book, and we sat down, and we didn't move from the table where we were for 5 hours. And essentially, he wanted to know how the decision was made to use nuclear weapons at the end of the Second World War. And without going into a lot of detail, I briefly summarized what had led up to Potsdam, the Potsdam Conference in July '45, and how Harry Truman had done a 180-degree turn, and that unknown to most Americans and most people in the world concerned with this issue, that the established consensus among Roosevelt's and Truman's top advisors in June and July of '45 was that we could have a negotiated surrender, a negotiated peace with the Japanese. So he wanted to know all the details, and I told him that I could. And I noticed throughout his conversation this man's nervousness. He is a general who now sits in Pakistan's general headquarters. And I said, and I've been already interviewing a number of his senior colleagues in Pakistan and also in India, and I said, do you feel like I do, that there could possibly be not only an intentional, but an accidental nuclear war between the two states? He said, absolutely. I'm terrified. And he said, I don't know if you've ever heard of the Odry blast. Let me tell you a story. In fact, I had heard of the Odry camp blast.
Louder, please.
In fact, I had heard of the Odry camp blast, which he brought up, which was an event that had occurred in Pakistan in 1987, I believe. Yes, I was in Pakistan at the time. Odry was an arms depot just outside Islamabad, the capital, which the United States and Pakistan's intelligence agencies used as a staging point for weapons going into Afghanistan. Long story short, it mysteriously blew up, and the explosions from that blast lasted several hours in the Rawalpindi, Islamabad area. An estimated 2,000 people were killed. Rockets, shrapnel flew all over the Pakistani capital. The American school rocket landed in the auditorium building, the main auditorium. And this military officer told me the story of how he had been a junior officer in another Pakistani city called Multan, and how his corps command had spent 2 hours trying to find out what the hell was happening in the capital, and could not get a clear answer from the general headquarters, which was in complete chaos and confusion. And the assumption in Multan at the Corps headquarters was that the Kahuta installation, which is the Pakistani nuclear installation outside of Islamabad, was under Indian air attack. And he said, if at that date we had had nuclear weapons, as we do now, he and I had already discussed what I already knew, and which he confirmed, that we would have probably gone to default orders, which is launch on attack, meaning before there was a full-scale attack, meaning destroying our capability completely, we would have launched a counterattack under the presumption that we were under attack from India. And I said, well, of course, you know you would have started a nuclear war in South Asia. He says, I know. And that's what terrifies me today. He and I then went on to discuss the fact that there's hardly any nuclear doctrine that exists on either side. That what a doctrine exists, and this unsettles a great many Pakistani and Indian officers, is that essentially they have adopted the NATO-Israeli doctrine on nuclear weapons, particularly in Pakistan, which has the view that if India, for example, crosses the border with conventional forces in an area such as Kashmir, Pakistan, like NATO, had the view that if Soviet conventional forces crossed into Western Europe, the United States and NATO reserve the right to use nuclear weapons first against conventional forces. And in fact, this is essentially the operational doctrine. To the degree it exists in Pakistan, in fact, there's a great deal of confusion and incoherence. And as Admiral Ramdas in India says, it's hogwash to think that there's an incoherent nuclear doctrine in India. But I just want to say one or two more points, which is there's also a distinction that should be made about the danger in India and Pakistan, which is it's the first time two contiguous countries have had nuclear weapons capability. During the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union had a sliver of time of 25 minutes before intercontinental ballistic missiles would hit each other during a nuclear exchange. And in that time, to the degree it was conceivable and possible, they could communicate and try to check on whether an accident, for example, was occurring. Now, there's a very interesting article written by two friends of ours, called Zia Mia and Nair, A.H. Nair. They're both physicists from Pakistan, who wrote an article in the Pakistani newspaper called The News, No Time to Think. Zia and Nair, who were at Princeton this summer and learning the secrets of a lot of the disillusioned American nuclear weapons designers and men who firsthand had the experience of nuclear planning, heard about several incidents, including there are actually about 2,000 very serious incidents that happened during the Cold War. But one that they related in their newspaper piece was that in the 25-minute framework, in one incident, the United States and the Soviet Union went to 23 minutes, with the United States under the impression that the Soviets had launched a full-scale nuclear attack on the United States, with the Russians telling the Americans, check your computers, we haven't done this, you're going to create a tragedy for the entire world. 23 minutes into it, the Americans discovered there was, in fact, a computer simulation program which had been run in a far-flung corner of the Strategic Air Command the day before and had been improperly removed and therefore had started up and spread throughout the entire network. Now, they had 23 minutes to check, and they miraculously found their mistake. It's incidents like this that turned the hair on the back of General Butler's neck, who commanded nuclear forces, and turned him into a nuclear abolitionist. But in Pakistan and India, as Zia and Nair said in their piece,
3 minutes.
there is no time to think. There's between 3 and 6 minutes missile flight time between the two countries. You can't even begin to have a meeting. You can't begin to, it's humanly and technically impossible to begin to assess what the hell is going on before a response is probably carried out. Now, what does that mean? In India and Pakistan's case, there's a study that was done in 1992 called After Midnight that describes a moderate nuclear exchange between the two countries. Moderate being perhaps 12 weapons targeted on each other's cities. It's estimated that if a moderate nuclear exchange occurred, there would be 47 million deaths. Now that was at a megatonnage that was being estimated in 1992. In fact, most of the weapons that were being detonated or being deployed are about 3 times the power of Hiroshima. And there is a brand study that in a modest nuclear exchange, the potential death toll in South Asia in one day could be 100 million people. Let me just conclude by saying that after scores of interviews with military officers and political officials in both India and Pakistan, I developed a sense of a perverse form of anti-imperialism being expressed. Those who are pro-nuclear in India say, see, we showed the West that we don't accept, quote, nuclear apartheid. We know how to do this, and we can stand up to you. In Pakistan, A.Q. Khan, one of the leading scientists that's designing the bomb, said, the West didn't think Muslims could do it. We showed them. Well, you know, what's been shown is that they haven't become different from the United States and the nuclear weapon states. They have essentially been cloned the ideology, the nuclear ideology of the nuclear weapon states. They have not become distinct, but they have become like the nuclear weapon states. And therefore, like during the Cold War, they threaten to use against each other weapons of mass annihilation, which I think the World Court in 1996 correctly described as weapons of war criminals. To use these, because essentially what needs to be understood, these are not weapons that can be distinguished, that can distinguish between civilian and military targets. They are essentially weapons of terror against civilians.
The hour is late, but if you have any questions, we are here. Yeah.
I was just wondering.
Louder so I can hear you.
I was just wondering how, I mean, Iraq hasn't been talked about a lot, and that concerns me of what is happening to Iraq, and I just compare that to what happens to Israel, you know, when international treaties are broken. That's it. how do you think the condition of the Iraqi civilians would be different today if Iraq had been a nuclear state?
I'm afraid that you are asking a very important question because I hear that all the time. During my stay in Pakistan, before Pakistan tested, the two questions that were asked of me all the time, and I found very hard to answer, was, would Bosnians have suffered a genocide before the noses of the West and NATO if they had nuclear weapons? And the second question was, would Iraq continue to suffer if it had nuclear weapons? The answer to it is yes. Both is, unfortunately, yes. It's an absolute yes. Quite frankly, I think that if Iraq had nuclear weapons, at the moment what you are seeing is about 1 million Iraqis are dying from the cruel sanctions that the United States has imposed upon them. If it had nuclear weapons or even a sign of it, Baghdad would have been the next Hiroshima and Basra the next Nagasaki. They would not have hesitated to do it. Because that other threat of a possible Soviet rivals was also removed. As for Israel, it's a country with a license. It is not a normal country at the moment. And its abnormality should not be, its abnormality should be a subject of opposition and resistance among thinking people, but it should not be a subject of emulation in my view. Everybody, every country is not Iraq. Every people have not gone through the Holocaust. Every state does not have a strong lobby in the United States, and so on and so forth. Every country is not as, perceives itself as threatened as the Israelis do. So there's a whole set of unique characteristics to Israel which makes it unique, and we shouldn't even try to emulate it. That the United States and Israelis themselves, I frankly find the American peace movement totally disgusting when they protest nuclear weapons and do not bring up the name of Banu. Banu is rotting in prison for opposing nuclear weapons, and illegally. He is the nuclear scientist who had revealed some of the details of Israeli nuclear program. The Israelis' secret services kidnapped him from Italy, and since then he has been rotting in prison without really a proper trial. So we should protest those things, just as we must protest Pakistan, we must protest India, we must protest the United States, we must protest Israel too. But we shouldn't try to emulate it, that's all I'm saying. And I really think Bosnia would have occurred without it. Iraq would have been worse if they had the weapons. Any other question? Yeah.
Yeah, what is your take on the recent U.S. just ignored the proposal by India and Pakistan to sign the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty in return for the removal of sanctions, and the U.S. hasn't responded?
Have you noticed all these good questions are coming from South Asians at the moment? They haven't quite ignored it. They are negotiating under the table. Clinton's head keeps popping up because of Monica and the scandal and so on. They are all negotiating under the table. And my expectation is that both India and Pakistan will sign CTBT during 1998. Do you share that feeling? Yeah. I think they are both close to signing CTBT. But remember, signing CTBT is not abolition of weapons. It's a very small step forward. The United States has effectively signed CTBT but keeps testing anyway. So it's a small step, but they will sign it. Yeah, any other? Yeah.
We've talked mainly about the sort of external reasons that the BJP exploded the bomb. What's your take on the sort of the internal and domestic reasons?
Excellent question. The question is, I have talked about the external stimuli for testing the bomb in India. In both countries, in differing ways, more in India than Pakistan, the testing occurred by a very small, threatened, insecure minority government. The test, at least for some time, tended to solidify them. We were not even sure that the BJP would last for 6 more weeks, and the testing kind of gave them a lease on life. It's a good question. Thank you. Maulana.
I'm not going to say anything here.
Say it.
I'll say it. Well, a couple of things. I mean, it's partly to challenge you a little bit.
Yeah, good. But if you're challenging, do it more loudly, no?
Yeah, I'll do it gently also, which is that in the Indian case, it's kind of false to focus on the BJP as the problem. I think they pulled the nuclear trigger. But the constituency for a nuclear India is not purely Hindu nationalist. There is a broader base in Indian society. I mean, the folks who came together was the believers of Ram, or the ones who claim that they're defending the nation of Ram, and very secular scientists who are also profoundly insecure about modern India and its place in the world. And to sort of simply speak in terms of fanatical nationalists is very problematic. And any comments on that?
Oh yeah, I think you are right about it.
And then the arms race, the other part is the arms race.
I think you are right.
It's a much older arms race than others.
It is rather striking. If I have given an impression that the testing would never have occurred if the BJP didn't come into office, then I have given the wrong impression. The Indian nuclear program developed much before the BJP was even struggling to come into power. And the first tests in 1974 in Pokhran were carried out by the government of the Indian National Congress. So I don't think it's a BJP problem only. Indian ruling elite of all parties have completely renounced the most important of Gandhi's legacy. See, Gandhi's legacy is not merely non-violence. Gandhi's legacy was his insight that power doesn't come from the barrel of the gun. Britain's coercive power Britain's power was based on coercion. And he was struggling, he starts his movement at the time when the pressure in India was for the national movement to go towards armed struggle. His insight was that power comes from organizing people and doing it morally. That insight that moral power can be more powerful than coercive power was the primary achievement of Gandhi. And that achievement, that legacy, the Indian leadership started to renounce under the Indian National Congress itself. The whole notion that India has to be a superpower, those of you who are used to it, I have to tell you a story. 1979, I make my first visit to India. And at that time, Mr. Vajpayee was the foreign minister, who is now the prime minister. And he opened a disarmament conference with me. I and him were the inaugurators of that conference. So he listened to me rather intently, and later on he said, Dr. Saab, I agree with everything you say, but you see, India is not like the others, etc. So I said, why are you doing this aircraft business? They had just given a $5 billion contract, I think, I'm not sure of my numbers, to Jaguar. So I said, why are you doing that? He said, you know, we are the only country, large country, which does not have the penetration aircrafts. And you should talk to our Prime Minister. So I called up and got an interview with Morarji Desai, who was a follower of Gandhi. He was a devoted follower of Gandhi. And I said, Morarji, why this deep penetration aircraft? He said, of the great powers, only India does not produce its own deep penetration aircraft. I started counting under the table in my feet. I said, what does he mean? United States, Soviet Union, of the four great powers, he said. United States, Soviet Union, China, India. Or what did he have in mind? Britain, India, something. Of the four great powers only. Well, I went to see Mrs. Gandhi. I said, how do you think, Mrs. Gandhi was in the opposition at the time. So I said, how do you feel things are going? It's very bad, the economy is falling apart. This government is doing nothing, this government is correct, this government is doing that. I said, very good. All its policies, she said, are wrong. So I said, good. What do you think of this contract they have just given to Jaguar? She said, terrible, terrible. The French were much better producers. We should have given a contract. So I said, you too believe in deep penetration aircrafts? Why? She said, of the four great powers, unbelievable. The idea of India had changed from Gandhi's already. And the end of the Cold War increased that compulsion. Massively. I agree with you there. Any other? Anybody else for deep penetration aircraft? Yes, sir.
Now, President Clinton has scratched his planned trip to India and Pakistan. Do you think it has anything to do with his unwillingness to hear India and Pakistan say, if you don't disarm nuclearly, why do you expect, you can't expect us to do it?
It's partly that, partly two other reasons. It's very embarrassing for him to go to India and Pakistan while this present inquisition, scandal, etc. goes on. But there is a second reason. He would like to see the negotiations over CTBT ended and the two countries sign up before visiting the two countries. That's the main reason. And also he doesn't want to hear those things. Mm-hmm. Yes?
Well, despite its position on India and Pakistan not signing the CTBT, why has the United States not ratified the treaty itself?
Oh, for only one reason. The treaty will not go into effect until all the countries all 44 countries have signed.
So why not?
The Congress, I think, will wait right up to the brink. That has been more or less, those who are experts on the United States can tell me better, but hasn't been that the history of the Congress with ratifications? Most ratifications. And I am not sure it is conceivable that after all the 43 have agreed, as happened with the League of Nations Treaty, the Congress will undercut the President and not sign it after all. The United States did not sign the Treaty on Genocide until last year. For 30 years they resisted the Treaty on Genocide. They don't like to join international agreement. Anything that will bind them to proper behavior. Any other?
Can we make an announcement about an important program next week dealing with this?
You making an announcement? Who can refuse you? Come on.
No.
Yes, please come. Come here, you will have to behave properly. Behind proper.
The Nuclear Abolition Task Force and the Interfaith Club at Amherst College are putting together a program involving Daniel Seekin next Wednesday, October 21st at 7 p.m. at Johnson Chapel on the Amherst College campus. He's a plowshare activist. I handed out many forms on the way in, and he is facing some federal prison time for opposing nuclear weapons. And if you have any more questions, you can talk to myself or somebody in this corner.
The plowshares are very dangerous people. They got me in prison twice, and I hope they get you in prison too. Many thanks, and just after about a week, I'll be back again next year, which has been lovely being with you. Thanks a lot.